This may look kind of weird, but I'm going to do a side-by-side with WFDSS Classic, just so I can show you guys the similarities and the differences. So this is the easiest way to get into the system is through the FAMAuth portal. This is the WFDSS Classic button here, and UAT is the system, the best system to request access to now. That is stable, and if you make edits to an incident you want to mess around with, the next time you log in, all that work you did is still be there. Whereas if you go into EDU, for instance, and you were to edit an incident, the next time we roll code, that might just get overwritten, which could be pretty frustrating if you're trying to learn the system. So when you first log into the system in NextGen, you'll come in here to this Incidents tab, and the first thing you'll notice is we have all these fire icons. Those are all fires that are being brought in from Irwin. It's limited to fires within the last 6 months, and they have to be not contained, not controlled, and not out. So active fires in the last 6 months is the current filter. If we need to open that up in the future, we could. We did it to cut down on the number of fires that are in this list. WFDSS Classic, I have my profile set to jump into analyses, since that's mostly what I'm doing on wildfires. But if you had it set to incidents, this is what your incident search would look like. It's more tabular, and this is more of a reporting kind of query than the simple search that we've implemented in NextGen. So I was going to go through the Horton fire, which is a recent fire in Arizona. Had a lot of good stuff in the decision. So I'll just search for both of those fires here. Okay, and the first thing I'll show you in NextGen is like when I search in that right-hand panel, you'll see it limits it. NextGen is limited to the view of your extent, and so we did that so that we could cut down on the search. So if you're only interested in the fires in Colorado, you may not see all the other fires, but you'll see my list on the right-hand panel is actively changing as I zoom in and out because we're querying. So if you don't see your fire, it's probably because your map extent is wrong, or as you'll see here in the right-hand panel, there's a lot of Horton fires that are controlled out, and if that's the case, you're not going to see it show up in your right-hand panel. The ones that match are the ones that are not contained here, and there's only one. So easy one to jump to. So we'll jump right into the information for this fire. I'm going to go pretty quick, and if people have questions, just type them into the chat. Wes is on here, and he can help answer questions. So can Niels. But you don't need to hold your questions till the end. Just put them right into chat. So first big difference here is that WFDSS NextGen, you don't leave the map. From incident search all the way through your decision, the map is always available. You can expand your right-hand panel to give you more room to work, or you can expand your map, but it never goes away. So you always have access to what you were doing in the context of your decision in your right-hand panel. WFDSS Classic is a little bit different. You jump back and forth to various maps. In this case, it would be the situation map. That's the map for the incident. The decision, if I wanted to go to that, I click on decision, and now I'm inside the incident where I can get access to the analysis. If I hadn't started this decision, pressing that button would have prompted me to actually start a decision. Just going to turn off the layer here real quick. And then when we start a decision in WFDSS NextGen, this is one big difference. We automatically generate a planning area. And 7 miles by 7 miles, centered on the point of origin. And we do that so that we can get a values inventory called a spatial inventory in WFDSS NextGen, because values is a separate chunk, kind of a latent term. So we automatically do a spatial inventory, and in the future we may automatically be doing some fire behavior analyses so that line officers don't need to wait for an analyst to give them something. They'll have at least some core information to make a decision from. The advantage of doing that spatial inventory is we can do things like this, where we generate these charts based on that spatial inventory. These are some RMA layer charts that Wes Hall put together that we have in here that you can download then as JPEGs or PDFs or PNGs. And if you want to upload this back into your decision, you could. All right. So that is the first big difference. The next one, so I'm going to go to relative risk. So relative risk in WFDSS NextGen follows the PMS 236 much more closely than Classic does. Classic has what we call zimograms in here. And this was actually a really fortunate example because it hits on something that came up in Aaron Noonan's PhD, which is the zimograms tend to slant toward a higher risk. So I copied over all of this incidence relative risk values. You end up getting this chart. I apologize for the color there, but I have my screen set to dark mode. And what this indicates from the PMS 236 guidance is that it should be a moderate, whereas the zimogram in Classic indicates that it would be a high. So when I copied this over, I just clicked it as a high because that's what the user certified when they published this. So, and I put their final assessment for their relative risk in here. The other difference is in NextGen, we allow the user to do each element individually. So time of season, barriers to fire spread, and then you can also upload things like images into this rich text editor for each element. Whereas in Classic, users usually break these out manually on their own. So they'll break out fuel condition or time of season, etc. So it gives them a little bit more flexibility to dive into each of these elements. When you're done doing a relative risk, you mark this as ready for publication in NextGen. If you want to move on to an org assessment in Classic, you have to publish the relative risk. So that is one difference. Your relative risk will not be published on its own in NextGen. It's published as part of a decision. We're going to allow users to download a draft decision, which will spit out a PMS 236 for them if they want that on its own. So once you mark that as ready for publication, you can go over to your org assessment and you'll see your relative risk information has now been pushed over to the org assessment. And then I just went through and copied over this incidence elements again individually. One difference here in NextGen is that if you mark your org assessment, or if it comes out as a recommendation that you have a CIMT, you have to do a Part D, which is this functional complexity. That unlocks this tab up here. And very similar, right? Just a rating, text. You could put extra pictures or format this text if you wanted to in NextGen, but very similar in content. So I went over that stuff pretty quick. I'm going to pause real fast for any questions so far. I don't see any hands up. Okay. So I'm going to move on to, excuse me, on to objectives. In this is one big difference. In NextGen, we are referring to the objectives section as strategic assessment, and we did that because it builds on objectives. It's objectives and requirements plus some ISAP integration. If you want to use the ISAP integration, it's optional, but you don't necessarily have to. I previously went through and put in all of this particular fire's objectives. So to Aaron's point earlier, we have these complicated fires with a lot going on. This particular fire has a lot of values. They've got aquatic invasive species, caves, cultural, fire ecology, forestry and forest products, invasive species terrestrial. So I added all those in here. And one thing we will allow people to do in NextGen, so if I click on that, let's see here. Oh, excuse me, I was clicking in the wrong spot. If I click on one of these requirements, it'll populate up here, and you'll see I can categorize these. So incident requirement and objectives are in here if you just want to do it the way you've always done it. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these objectives and requirements and classify them, you can do that too. We put some extra categories in here like missed tactics or resource concerns, and we tied in some of the relative risk and organization assessment elements as well. So in the future, if you enter information in this part of your decision, we can also reflect that in the relative risk so the user doesn't have to duplicate that. Let me go through critical values at risk. So we have two extra items here in NextGen. One is highlighting things in the decision. So if there's a requirement that you just want to make sure that doesn't slip through the cracks, like this read use on this fire, that's a requirement on this particular incident, you can highlight that in the decision. If this was a critical value at risk, like, let's do Mexican spotted owl habitat, maybe. So I've got Mexican spotted owl habitat here. If I wanted to mark this as a critical value at risk, these are the ISAP categories for that. Then you would mark the probability. I'll go through and do that. Gives you the risk rating, and then you can mark whether it's a value at risk because of fire behavior or fire management actions, and then add that to your table. And this is a great example of a development environment, so our case service doesn't seem to be working for that, but this would just add it to the table down below, and then you'll be able to sort based on whether something's a critical value at risk. So when you're going through the ISAP process, you could go through here, do all your critical values at risk, and then come to that ISAP meeting with all your critical values at risk tied to incident objectives and requirements. And if you add additional ones, you could put those in here, and if you need to tie those to shapes on the map, you can do that. So you could draw shapes in here, or you could select from shapes. One of the other things we do when we clip that planning area is we clip your spatial fire planning. So in the case of this incident, they have a couple unit level fire planning shapes. I believe they have some strategic objective shapes as well, and these actually have text associated with them. So we clip these shapes as well. So if you want to tie objectives and requirements directly to your spatial fire management plan, you can do that. And we give you a lot of different categories of shapes to do that, from pods, multi-unit non-overlapping shapes, all the way down to sub-unit overlapping shapes, which would be similar to management requirements. Okay. I'm going to move on to the course of action. So for this particular fire, they wanted to restrict their fire spread to a pod, a particular pod. So I went ahead and put that in here. So I'm going to pull that up. This is their pod that they wanted to restrict their fire to. And as you can see from the fire perimeter that's already in the system, they've done a pretty good job of doing that. If you read through their course of action here, they want to implement an effective fire suppression strategy using direct attack where they can, or where topography prohibits it, use indirect attack. Point protection, whatever's appropriate, natural features and barriers. So that's the course of action that they're implementing in this particular shape. If they wanted to do multiple course of actions, I've set that up on this particular incident. They could, or they could just do one course of action for their entire planning area. Actually, let me scroll up and show you what it looks like when you have one course of action. So one thing we are doing in WFDSS NextGen is having users tie this to NWCG strategies, so that in the future we can integrate with 209. That was a requested feature to incorporate our map products, specifically the MDAT, which is the Management Direction Alignment Table. And the easiest way to do that was to be the authoritative data source on the management direction. So we've laid the groundwork to be able to do that. It also sets us up to comply with the Dingle Act and a couple specific provisions of that that we need to notify secretaries when their management direction on the fire is inconsistent with the Land and Resource Management Plan. So if I scroll back down here, if I have multiple strategies, this is controlled by this table down here, which gives an order of operations for the course of action. So I pulled up this smaller course of action, which is this pod versus the entire planning area. Let me just zoom out a little bit. This shape here is their planning area. So if I want to change that order and do multiple strategies on this fire, I pull those around. This shape is now on top. So when the fire leaves this particular course of action, I'll be shifting course of action outside that particular area, and you can see it updated with the alternative strategy for the pod, which is confine contain. If I wanted to go back and change that as well, you could do multiple shapes with the same strategy if you wanted to, and just change this to full suppression. But maybe your course of action is a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah, Niels has his hand up. I just wanted to let you know.
Oh, go ahead, Niels.
Yeah, Sam, I was just going to tell you, you can see that on the map now as well. So if you turn that incident course of action layer on the map, turn that layer on, then you can actually visualize your strategy on the map. That's different from Classic as well. And you can turn the assessments off, turn the assessments group off. And
which one? The analyses?
The strategic assessment group.
Oh, the strategic assessment group.
Yeah. It helps to turn one or off if you're, and then we'll go down to the group. Sorry, in the table of contents again. Open that up in the layer list, and then scroll down, and you can turn the incident course of action on. Keep going.
It's on.
No, keep going down. That incident course of action layer at the bottom.
Oh, this is the new one. Okay.
Yeah, that actually visualizes what strategies you have created on your map. And when you change the order of your course of actions, it will actually reflect that in the layer on the map. So primary, so the one on top there is what confine control.
Yeah, let me just
so
change it so
that
we can see the color change.
And yeah, if you click incident info, it's easier to unselect the highlights there. But yeah, I just want to remind you to turn that layer on. That way you can see the course of action that you actually have highlighted to those different areas on the map.
Lined out. Yeah, thanks, Niels. Are there questions on this? Because this is a bit of a departure in that you can assign a course of action to a shape that's smaller than your planning area if you choose to do that. So you can go for the whole planning area as we've always done, but it does eliminate this slider bar and the confusion that that caused sometimes by moving toward NWCG strategies. Are there questions on that before I move on to cost? Okay. Next section is cost, and this is a pretty straightforward section as well. It looks nearly identical. It's the estimated final cost. One difference is that you will have to say in the context of WFDSS NextGen what the method was that you used. Not a big difference, but that's just a mandatory field now. We will also try to pull in the Irwin estimated cost to date. This is currently dummied up. And we'll show you what the source was for that estimated cost to date and when that came through, so that you can see if you're putting in a cost that might be lower than the estimated cost to date, or if the cost to date is quite a bit closer to your estimated final cost. Maybe you want to bump that up a little bit. Then you'd put in your narrative, save that, and of course you can download the spreadsheet. We also added in the ISAP cost estimator spreadsheet in here as well. Once you've done that, you can move on to the decision approval, where you would fill out your rationale for your decision, and then you'll submit it for approval, at which point you'll be able to access all the required decision elements list. So you'll be able to see if you're missing anything in order to submit this for approval. And then your decision approval will be very similar to Classic in that you'll line out the numbers of days between assessments for your periodic assessment. You'll put in your notes. One difference in NextGen is that we did put this box in here that kind of lines up with ISAP, which is I've reviewed the incident tactics and confirmed they're consistent with my strategy. So ideally you're talking to the operations folks. So if you click that, and you could save, and then you'd be able to approve the decision. I don't have all the sections of this decision locked for publication, ready for publication yet, so I wouldn't be able to even demo that part for you. But I can do that while we wait if there's any questions. I'll take those now. Okay. One other thing that I did gloss over is this reported strategy section. This also goes toward the future of Dingle Act and being the authoritative source for management direction. We are going to allow people in the future to integrate with 209, but for now what this tab does is it pushes this information to Irwin, not to the 209. In the future, if the 209 decided to pull this information from Irwin, then it would go to the 209. But for now, this information goes directly to Irwin. So any system reading Irwin would see the WFDSS strategy that you push, or you could bypass that and just not report your strategy to Irwin. That's all I had for the demo. It was pretty fast. Are there questions on anything in relationship to NextGen I can answer? Noonan, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, Sam, a couple maybe just points to make, and I also ask you these questions. Like, what was the impetus to make this be more of a like to make the strategy spatial? Because that's a big change from Classic. Like where did
Yeah.
that idea arise from?
So that's tied to that Dingle Act requirement that asks us to relay to the secretaries anytime a strategy differs from what is outlined in the Land and Resource Management Plan. So in order to do that, we need to know a couple things, right? We need to know what strategies are allowed in your Land and Resource Management Plan. And then we also need to know what strategies you're implementing on your fire currently. And then in the future, what we would do is compare those two strategies. And if they're out of sync, then we can send that notification to the secretaries, probably with a lengthy narrative or justification from the incident to explain why they're out of sync. There could be some really valid reasons why that is. So that was the main impetus. And to also integrate the management direction alignment table. Because if you're going to be clear about what you're doing on a particular piece of land, you have to be clear on what that particular piece of land is. And the easiest way to do that is to make it spatial.
Okay, thanks for that. And then my follow-up question is, can you provide a little history on what the MDAT effort was and why you included it in WFDSS NextGen?
Yeah, well, I can give you as much as I know. I'm sure there's other people that know a lot more, but as far as I know, MDAT, and when I was made aware of it, was around 2017, I believe. And the Management Direction Alignment Table was an effort to clarify the management direction on a fire because there was conflicting information within the 209 or within WFDSS. Some of that came from the strategy slider. Someone might have like this slid way over the monitor or just off center. And there's a lot of lack of clarity with this slider because it's not in alignment with the NWCG strategies. And it became clear through the use of the MDAT that the management of the fire, the incident command team, and the agency administrators, and potentially some of our stakeholders and partners had very different ideas of what was happening with this fire. And through many official channels, there was conflicting information. I think MDAT actually also gave rise to the ISAP process, if I'm not mistaken, because that revelation that the incident command team and the AA thought different things on this fire was how ISAP was supposed to kind of bring those things together and make sure that what the AA wanted done on the fire was actually feasible from a tactical standpoint and from a safety standpoint. So it's just an intersection, I think, Aaron. If you wanted more information, I'd have to get with like Morgan Pence or Diane or somebody that was more directly involved in MDATs. I was mostly just a consumer.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions on WFDSS NextGen? Capabilities, functionality. I do have a couple slides on what's going to be in 1.0 for stuff we didn't go over in the context of this demonstration. Okay. Do you want me to go through that, Aaron? I can. Oh,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hey,
Sorry,
Sam,
Kim. Go ahead.
could you explain a little bit about how this has been received by, different people that have already been in the system and, some of the feedback that you've been given?
Sure. So I spent a lot of last summer traveling around to different geographic areas where time allowed to do just that, Kim, to get some feedback. And so we can incorporate any feedback from the field before it was too late to do that development-wise. So the two places I went, and there's Rick is on here too, and Wes, and they represented different areas as well. But Pacific Northwest and Alaska are two of the big geographic areas I went to. And it was pretty good reviews. Alaska is a big fan of the ability to utilize their fire management options in that multi-unit non-overlapping layer and be able to attach language there and kind of skip some of the hurdles they've had to do with their management direction options and their documentation. So they see this as being able to save them a lot of time, and in spots where their planning area might include 2 fire management options, they'll be able to clearly reflect that and the different strategies they're implementing and why they're doing what they're doing and where they're doing it. So it removes a lot of work from the field for them. We were able to get some extra layers in there. That was their concern, is that some of the things like known sites weren't included for Alaska, so we included those. It's one of the advantages in NextGen is that being service-based, we can bring in a lot of services, especially if they already exist. So it was easy to get known sites in there for them. And now those come up in the spatial inventory as well. So when they're planning area clips, they can see their known sites in the spatial inventory, and then they can push those into their decision for their values at risk, critical values at risk, and they're able to document that better. Pacific Northwest, and especially the BLM, were very receptive to this because they want to be able to use multiple strategies on a wildfire. Their concern was that they were going to have to rethink some of the ways they currently had their spatial fire planning data structured. I think we've been able to get with them and get most of those concerns allayed. The advantage of using the spatial fire planning service, of course, is that the users are in control of it, so it gives them a much bigger window to get their spatial fire planning ready for fire season, which I think made Ian and Justin and a bunch of folks pretty happy, because it gives them a bigger window to get their spatial fire planning ready for how they want to use WFDSS NextGen.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Any
Hey,
other
Sam,
questions?
I have another
Yeah,
thing
go
I
ahead.
think is probably important to explain, which, and maybe Wes can tackle this, but just the connection with spatial fire planning service and WFDSS NextGen, how those are connected, and why did we do a new spatial fire planning service?
You want me to tackle that one, Sam?
Yeah, go for it. While you do it, I will navigate to course of action here and show
Right.
where some of that stuff's looped in.
Perfect. So spatial fire planning service, when we started the WFDSS NextGen project, incorporating spatial fire planning information was originally deemed out of scope. And so we had to explore other opportunities of providing the field the opportunity to develop, maintain a system where they could store their spatial fire planning information, both spatially and tabularly, so the language associated with the spatial shape of the context of the language, whether it be unit level, subunit level, or even now we have a new category, multi-unit level. And so what we explored to do, and this was years ago when Andrew Bailey was still with the RD&A, is in turning the spatial fire planning into a service through ArcGIS Online that can be managed and housed as a spatial service rather than a portion of the application. And so that's what we've been working on for the last couple of years as a side project to NextGen WFDS, is developing spatial fire planning service. Really the biggest benefit of having it as an outside service is it makes it more user-friendly and editable by the field themselves. So if they do have another update or a new update to their land and resource management plan, they're able to go in and make those edits either spatially or tabularly with their language as they need to. So that can even happen within an incident or during an incident. We couldn't do that within the application of WFDSS Classic, just due to some of the requirements of uploading those shapes into the GIS server that WFDSS Classic runs on. We had to do that on a scheduled time throughout the year. So there were several periods of time throughout a year where shapes could be provided to WFDSS, and then the developers would have to go in and manually upload those, and then the user has to come back in and assign that language to it. So we eliminated some of that time delay by pulling the spatial fire planning outside of WFDSS and establishing its own service. It works very similar to the pod service or even the new ISAP service that sits within AGOL. So there's two components to the service. There's the spatial component, which is the shape itself, and Sam's going to show some of those here in just a second. And then the language tied to it is tied to a related table. And we had to do that in two separate pieces because oftentimes there's a one-to-many relationship. So we could have one shape with multiple entries of language pertaining to that individual shape. So doing the language as a related table basically gave us the flexibility to have that one-to-many relationship. But the biggest reasons that we pulled spatial fire planning outside of the application was, again, one, being out of scope initially when we started the project, and two, to provide that flexibility and ease of use to the fire community so that they can manage their data more readily, and they don't have that delay that we've had for the last, since 2009. So I'll get back to you, Sam.
Well, thanks, Wes. Yeah, so what Wes is talking about, this is the ingestion of the spatial fire planning service. And to his point, if you wanted to, let's say I was consuming this layer here and I was interested in using this in my decision, but some of the language was wrong, the user could now go into the spatial fire planning service, update that language, refresh their screen here, and use the corrected language in their decision, instead of calling the RD&A and the data team get in there and help adjust language, hours and hours and hours of waiting. Now this can happen almost instantaneously. Or if there's shapes missing, they can then add those shapes and the language into that service.
Nils has his hand up.
Nils?
Nils.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention too that those are tied to the planning area. So if you update your planning area, you can update those shapes too. So when you first start your decision, we clip those from the spatial fire planning service into those separate incident layers. And if you update your planning area, you can update the shapes for the strategy as well. Yeah, if you turn that layer on, then yeah, you'll see the full shapes there. That's the full fire planning service on there. And what we've done is we've clipped those by the planning area so you can use them in your strategies. So if you redraw your planning area, you can regenerate those strategic planning areas, those strategic spatial fire planning shapes.
Yeah, that was another feedback from Alaska, especially, Kim, is that, as their planning areas grew, there was a lot of frustration with all these strategic objectives and management requirements would end up in their decision, but then they were having to replicate some of the language of those, adding in additional objectives and requirements to build on those. to say, yeah, here's what it says in the land and resource management plan, and here's what we're doing about it. And now you can tier directly to that by selecting those shapes and saying, here's the land and resource management plan guidance, and here's what we're doing about it.